You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 25th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's program, nations urge their citizens to leave Lebanon as fighting between Israel and Hezbollah escalates. After that, we'll join Monocle's Laura Kramer at InnoTrans 2024 in Berlin, the mobility fair. What have you got for us, Laura?
Well, Chris, I'll tell you about the big premieres, the latest AI rail technology, and the resurrection of an internationally beloved mascot.
Looking forward to that, Laura. We'll also get the latest business headlines, and then
we put this on the main channel, prime time. So I think that the bravery that you have in the scheduling of this, I think, is a major factor.
A report on why Norway is opting for slower television. And finally, people of a certain generation may remember this. Tamagotchi, the egg-shaped pet video game, gets its own store 30 years later right here in London. All that on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. To Germany's capital now, which is playing host this week to the world's largest mobility trade fair known as InnoTrans. And riding the rails for Monocle in Berlin is Laura Kramer, also known as Laura Kramer, over there in Berlin. Laura, I'm guessing that's how you're being introduced anyway.
They all think I speak German, which is very sweet. But yes, my name does make it seem that way.
So, first of all, before we get to the main event, Laura, I know that you have been reunited with a major crush you have over there, somebody you were extremely excited to meet all the way back in Paris. Did they recognize you again?
Chris, I'm at La Frige. I can't believe it. The beloved Paris Olympics mascot is here. It's at the French exhibition, part of the huge overall event, and I was so excited to see the Frige because I was wondering, what are they going to do? This is such a internationally beloved mascot. Are they going to keep her around somehow? And I was really happy to see that they had little miniatures of both the Frige and the Paralympics Frige there. I took a photo, of course.
Laura, just how confused was Le Frige about your excitement?
Very. I think there might be a restraining order coming, but in the meantime, there are a lot of people here. She won't see me lurking.
Okay, well, beyond La Frige, let's get to the main event. Set the scene for us. What is InnoTrans exactly about?
Well, it's my first time here, Chris, and I have to say, intimidating is not the word. There are so many people here. It's actually the biggest InnoTrans ever. There are almost 300 exhibitions from 59 countries. And to say it's big is an understatement. It is actually overwhelming to the point. But basically, the theme of this year is AI, the future of mobility with those type of technologies. And the opening ceremony of InnoTrans was especially about this artificial intelligence and the opportunities it offers for railway operators and the rail industry wider for the future of mobility. Now, there were also some big government names on hand. The Spanish Minister of Transport visited yesterday, and Germany's Federal Minister of Digital and Transport Affairs used his welcoming address to reaffirm the German government's support for the digitalization of the rail network. Now, it's very exciting because it's all about AI, there are some really cool technologies that we're seeing here. And actually, earlier this morning, I saw a Batmobile drone. Now, when you think drone, you kind of imagine something that's flying around and buzzing. But this is actually a trolley that can operate during interruptions to check the state of railways after maintenance activities and before reactivating circulation. So a lot of really cool stuff here.
Batmobile, only at night, I'm guessing then, for that repair operator. What kind of other big premieres have you seen over there at InnoTrans? I mean, as you say, it is this massive thing, so much going on. I've been to that convention center in Berlin. It is completely huge. How much have you been able to see?
Well, I'm trying to make my way through it all because there are 220 world premieres that are happening here, and I'm trying to see them all if possible. Yesterday, Stadler presented its zero-emission successor of one of its really successful Regio shuttles for non-electrified lines to the public for the first time. So the train actually had arrived at InnoTrans under its own power and will now undergo approval tests. Alstom also presented the longest tram in history, Chris, which will run on the streets here in Berlin. The vehicle is 50 meters long. So again, lots of exciting premieres, and it's a mix of stuff that's being approved, that's being tested out, and things that are going to be eventually rolled out really quickly.
That is one more reason for me to go back to Berlin for a weekend, test out that tram as soon as it's on the tracks. A couple of other things, Laura. I mean, AI, you talked about being a major theme, but what else has been catching people's eye over there?
Well, one of the reoccurring themes that I've noticed is noise reduction. I spoke to Lucas Tabal from Trela, that's a Swiss engineering company that's developing active steering for trams and trains. So that means steering wheels on the track to avoid wear and tear and damage to the track. That's one of the ones I was mentioning before that's in development and being tested now. And Lucas told me one of the added benefits is noise reduction for urban traffic.
In urban environments, I mean, the noise is becoming a real issue. So there's a lot of interest from especially environmental groups and public interest groups to have this technology implemented. But obviously in rail, everything has to be super safe, and that's why the development takes so long.
I do love, Laura, how kind of niche on the one hand all of this is, and yet extremely important to how we get around, whether it's noise reduction or the length of trams, all this kind of stuff. And we will let you get back to this because you have so much more, all of those premieres. There's a lot of walking at that convention center to get through all of them. But tell us what's on your agenda for day 2.
Yeah, my step count is definitely up. Well, I'm going to be speaking to a few more people here. I'm going to be heading over to the Ukrainian Railways exhibit. They've got a new partnership with Germany that I want to hear more about. I'm hoping to grab an interview there. I also spoke to a German aerospace center researchers, too, who told me that they're testing a lot of exciting things. So aside from the AI and the noise reduction, there's a big talk of automation. And we know fully automated vehicles, whether on secondary lines or obstacle detection, remote train control, virtual coupling, things like that. So these are big conversations that were happening here. And at the same time, some people are also looking at the design and how that plays a big role into this, because at the end of the day, user acceptance of technology is what really matters. And actually, I've heard of some companies who are also hiring psychologists to get on board to hear how people are reacting to the introduction of these new AI technologies. So what I'm hoping to do is to speak to a few more people from these areas, hear what the future is. And then also, I'm going to be honest, Chris, there's an Oktoberfest little section, and I think that's where I'm going to grab lunch.
Lunch, dinner, everything in between makes perfect sense to me. And do watch out, everybody. There may be a psychologist near you on a train coming up. Laura Kramer, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. A new wave of Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon has prompted countries, including the US and UK, to urge their citizens to leave the country by whatever means they can. Meanwhile, Hezbollah has sent a missile in the direction of Mossad's headquarters in Tel Aviv that was intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome before it could reach its target. Calls by the international community to agree a ceasefire appear to be increasingly falling on deaf ears. We're joined now by Hannah McCarthy, foreign correspondent in Beirut. Hannah, catch us up, first of all, on the last 24 hours. What's been happening?
Sure. Well, Israeli strikes have continued across the south. We've seen another strike north of Beirut as well, which is very worrying to people. And again, it's another strike. It's 100 kilometers from the Israeli border. So it's in a territory of Lebanon that people kind of thought they had a level of security. There's people who are fleeing the south and saying they don't want to come to Beirut because they do not think it's safe. They're going further north. So the city and other cities in New York or in Lebanon are now trying to cope with this mass exodus. The latest reports are about 500,000 people have been displaced. Some of these have been displaced for the last year, so they're already quite vulnerable. And some of the people who've recently moved left, with minutes kind of notice. They've brought very little with them, and they're heavily reliant on kind of charities at the moment because Lebanon, as a state, has been in an economic crisis for the last 5 years, and the government has few resources. So again, strikes across the south, and again that quite provocative strike by Hezbollah, firing a rocket towards Tel Aviv. It's said at the Mossad agency there.
Yeah, tell us more about that strike as well from Hezbollah. What do we take from that? Is it considered a warning, or is it, I suppose, a sign that we are basically in a full-scale war at this point?
It certainly seems we're in a situation where both parties have shown a much bigger appetite to inflict harm and absorb harm than they have in previous wars. To be honest, I think we're in a situation where events are kind of taking out, clear-eyed analysis. What is a concern is that Hezbollah doesn't have maybe a way to back down with a certain amount of face saving. It suffered, a devastating number of attacks over the last week. About 1,500 of its members are seriously injured from the pager attack. And it's now facing heavy strikes. So it needs to kind of show, it's feeling pressure to show a kind of, to engage in shows of force, which is possibly why it's engaging in that strike on Tel Aviv. We get the sense that neither side is backing down. At funerals over the weekend, there was this kind of language used of, that the deputy head of Hezbollah said, there's an ongoing and open-ended battle now with Israel. So that's not the kind of rhetoric that is suggestive of a peace deal or a negotiation anytime soon.
Well, this despite the US President Joe Biden yesterday in New York claiming that a diplomatic solution was still possible. Do you have any sense that efforts are underway in any way, shape or form to try and avert a conflict, and what that potentially would look like? I mean, as you suggest there, it doesn't seem like Israel is offering Hezbollah an off-ramp or that Hezbollah wants to take one.
Sure. I mean, it seems like there's a real absence of strong leadership from the international community in relation to the war in Lebanon and the escalation there. I mean, what Biden said at the UN Assembly is not very different from what he's said since the war in Gaza began. There doesn't seem to be any kind of change in policy, any suggestion that there'll be a decrease in arms. And at the same time, there's many Western governments and European governments. I know France has been taking a more active role in Lebanon, but to be quite frank, there's many governments that will privately not have a huge problem with Hezbollah's stockpiles of weapons and members being hit and the idea of them being weakened. The issue is obviously that there is significant civilian casualties happening and a humanitarian crisis that's happening alongside this weakening of Hezbollah's capabilities.
Well, and to that point, the fact that we also have countries calling for their own citizens to leave, how is that being taken? And I mean, the way you suggested this internal displacement that is taking place, are you getting the sense also in Beirut now that people are basically considering leaving?
Yes, I mean, some airlines have stopped flying, and then if you look at possible flights out over the next week, a lot of them are booked out or costing several $1,000s. Beirut's usually fairly resilient, but there's definitely a sense of panic at the moment. At the same time, those who have the resources to work elsewhere or kind of move elsewhere, a lot of them already have done so earlier in the summer or earlier in the war. And there was obviously that escalation in August which caused some people to leave. So I think we've had kind of a couple of waves where people, I guess, have already left. So I expect it to be busy this week in terms of leaving, but maybe a lot of people will already have left earlier in the year.
Hannah McCarthy in Beirut, thank you very much for joining us. Now here's Hassan Anderson with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. China has successfully conducted a rare launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile into the Pacific Ocean in its first such exercise in decades. The test came amid the ongoing United Nations General Assembly in New York, where Beijing has been stressing its position as a rival power to the United States and its role in leading shifts to the current global order. Voting is underway in 26 seats across the 6 districts of Jammu and Kashmir in the second phase of assembly elections today, where 2.5 million voters will decide the fate of 239 candidates. It is the first such election for a decade and the first since Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Hindu nationalist government scrapped the Muslim-majority region's semi-autonomy in 2019. And in South Korea, new figures indicate nearly 19,000 couples got married in July, up 33% from the previous year. The all-time high figure was propelled in part by per capita cash benefits worth $1,800 combined with greater housing opportunities for newlyweds. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Hassan. Time now to get a roundup of the day's business stories with Ewan Potts from Bloomberg. Ewan, we're going to start with, we've just been talking about the Middle East, actually, of course, on this show. And the rising tensions there are leading to higher prices in oil, as I understand, although maybe not as high as one might expect.
Hello, Chris. Yeah, if you've been to fill your car up over the past few weeks, you may be wondering why petrol and diesel are not more expensive given the rising tensions in the Middle East. Of course, if you look back over the decades, this sort of situation would have led to a big spike in prices. But there are a few reasons for this. Quite interesting to take a bit of a step back. One of the reasons, of course, is the growth of the US, which is now the world's biggest oil producer. But there's also something going on with the OPEC Plus cartel. A really interesting piece by my colleague, Javier Blas. He's been writing for Bloomberg Opinion about the problems of cheating in the OPEC cartel. Now, the countries in the OPEC Plus group have been collectively pumping around 600 barrels a day above their self-imposed limits since the beginning of the year. And in fact, the overproduction is now 850,000 barrels a day. It's been getting worse. Now, the group likes to blame everyone else for its problems, the news media, Wall Street analysts and speculators. But actually, there is a problem with overproduction and using that word cheating, my colleague prefers to call it. Now, Saudi is the de facto leader of OPEC, and it's been making increasing compliance with the quotas one of its priorities, including creating a so-called compensation mechanism. In the past, cheating was always forgiven at OPEC, so long as the sinners made promises of future compliance. But now they need to do penance by lowering production to offset past misbehaviours. The problem is the cheaters are not only continuing to cheat on their original quotas, but they're also cheating on the compensation quotas. So cheating on the anti-cheating, if you like. It's all a bit of a pickle for those who want higher oil prices. But if you're looking to fill up your car cheaply, then you're probably fine with it.
Good news for that. Always a lot of bizarre intrigue in OPEC, and that's just one dimension of it. One other story, though, that we wanted to look at, Ewan, there is labor trouble for Boeing. We've had this been going on for a few weeks now. Boeing has tried to make a pay offer to striking workers. What have they said?
Yeah, no sign of resolution yet in this strike by 33,000 Boeing workers. We've spoken before about the troubles that Boeing faces over safety concerns and, of course, those fatal crashes. But they've had a lot of Labour pickle this week. They tried on Monday to put a new offer directly to workers, and that has really upset the unions. The International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, which represents the striking Boeing employees, says that its survey of members is overwhelmingly clear. They are not interested in the new offer, calling it inadequate and disrespectful. Boeing had put forward a 30% pay hike over 4 years. That's better than was on the table a couple of weeks ago. They've also proposed reinstating the annual bonus and increasing contributions to pensions. But it was really the way they went about it which has caused a lot of disquiet with the unions. So no sign of a resolution in that strike. Boeing shares have not been good performers this year. It's actually the second worst performer on the Dow Jones, down some 40% over the course of the year, only beaten by the struggling chipmaker Intel.
Ewan, just to follow up on that quickly, I mean, what are airlines saying about this? At which point does this strike for Boeing become a problem for the entire sector?
Well, it's all good news, of course, for their big rival Airbus, the plane-making duopoly. But for a lot of airlines who are waiting for planes, it is a big problem. There's a massive backlog. The order books are very full. Of course, we saw that post-pandemic boom in air travel. So there's a lot of demand for air travel right around the world. Asia, particularly, the sector has been growing enormously fast. But even in the West, we're taking more flights than we used to. So a lot of airlines are keen to get new planes, and the queue for getting them is already long, and it is getting longer because at the moment Boeing are producing no planes. It's also an issue for Boeing's cash flow, as you might expect. Of course, they've got no money coming in because they're not delivering any planes, and the company's investment grade credit rating is also under threat. So Boeing really needs to get this sorted out, and quickly.
sorted out, even if there's no sign of how they're going to sort that out. We'll continue to follow this story, of course, on Monocle Radio. Ewan Potts from Bloomberg, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. In a world of streaming platforms and on-demand entertainment, finding audiences who are willing to tune into hours or even days of the same program may prove a challenge. In Norway, however, the slow television craze shows no signs of falling away. Xander Brett spoke to Thomas Hellum, a producer who has been involved since Norway's debut slow TV show in 2009, and also to commissioning editor Anniken Ness, who took a gamble on the format.
Last month, on the evening of the 24th of August, I came across a rather sodden group of camera operators in central Oslo. Their lenses were pointing at a stage that had sprung up in front of the Norwegian Parliament. They were filming a series of speakers as part of a live broadcast that marks 750 years since the coming into force of Magnus Lagabøte's Landslov, which created a common law for Norway. The broadcast was the latest instalment in Norway's slow television phenomenon, programmes that last several hours or even days. It all started back in November 2009 when NRK had a train journey from Bergen to Oslo, a 7-and-a-bit-hour programme that was co-created by Thomas Hellum.
We were planning a documentary about 100 years anniversary for a famous railway track in Norway from Bergen, where I live, and Oslo, the capital. Some of us came up with the idea, why if we just put some cameras on the train, film the whole journey, and there's 160 tunnels. So in the tunnels, we could put the archive material. And we laughed a lot in the lunch break, and we still laughed the day after. And then we called our commissioning editors, and first they didn't get it. But it took off when people used it in parties, turned down our sound, turned up their own music, had the pictures on.
Despite the show's somewhat unexpected success in a similar programme a year later, Thomas says the slow TV craze only really got going in June 2011, when viewers were invited aboard a Hurtigruten ship heading north. Running time for this programme, a record-breaking 134 hours, 42 minutes and 45 seconds. About half the Norwegian population tuned in at some point. Thousands turned out to greet the ship in person.
We said that if we're going to do this once again, what could happen if this was live? If people really knew that we were on board that train, how would it be? And then the idea came up with a coastal ship from Bergen to Kirkenes. And that was only after the coastal ship that the saying slow TV was invented or talked about.
Anniken Ness was one of the NRK commissioners who took a punt on slow television.
It has been a format where you can glue people to a channel for hours and hours. And I think that's also why it became so big. I remember we left Bergen, I was on the ship. There was not many people on the dock, just a few. But as the trip advanced, we started to note these people who came out with the flag. It became a national event, and we didn't realize in advance that it would be so big.
Plenty of slow television has been aired since. There was a 24-hour live broadcast of fishing and National Knitting Night, even a peep show of life at a bird feeder, 14 hours on NRK2, a mere 87 days online. Thomas Hellum.
This isn't something you choose on demand. This is something you watch as live event or you don't. We have never done the same thing over again. We have always tried to come up with a new angle, a new idea, a new story to tell. But for instance, in Sweden, each spring they follow the wandering of the moose. We have not done that in NRK. We have tried to come up with a new idea each time. And that, of course, is kind of shooting ourselves in the leg, because it's harder to come up with an idea that is weird enough, crazy enough to get the attention in the media, of course.
Anniken Ness.
We recognize that it has to be something that really goes to the heart of the culture of the country. It has to be something that is meaningful. But also one thing I think differ from what we did and other countries did is that we put this on the main channel or the next big channel, prime time. So I think that the bravery that you have in the scheduling of this, I think, is a major factor. But it could be something really special about the Norwegians, because when we did the National Firewood Night, It was like, can you actually do one evening program with a following full-nighter on burning firewood? Yes, you could.
Thomas Hellum again.
I do say to commissioning editors elsewhere, what's really the risk by doing something crazy in 2 or 3 days? You still have 362 days to do the rest. Our commissioning editors were brave enough to say, okay, take the channel for days. No news, just take it. If they didn't have the courage to do so, then Slow TV wouldn't be here.
But Slow TV is here, still here, and if Norway's viewing figures are anything to go by, it's here to stay. Could its appeal be down to a Norwegian pride in nature, a history of being cut off from the trends and fashions further south? Maybe, but the modern world has long since reached this northern outpost, and with a myriad of live channels and catch-up platforms to pick from, sitting back and drinking in hours of slow, simple serenity feels like a breath of fresh air.
That was Xander Brett in Norway on Slow TV. This is The Briefing. And finally, on today's show, if you were of a certain age back in the late 1990s, you will remember the craze of Tamagotchi, a little egg-shaped toy video game from Japan that was released in 1996 and took the world by storm. Well, the video game is back with a vengeance, and Tamagotchi is now getting its first ever official store right here in London. Here to tell us more is Rebecca Tay, retail expert and brand consultant. Rebecca, first of all, for those of us who might not be familiar, describe the game for us.
This is a funny one, isn't it? It's sort of hard to describe because it's a toy, it's a pet. I think the best way to describe it is a digital pet. So it's a little egg-shaped device. I guess it literally is the size of an egg. They come in very different colors, usually quite bright colors. And there's only 3 buttons on it and a little screen. And the idea is that it becomes a pet because it sort of hatches. It sort of becomes like this little animal. You have to feed it. You have to take care of it. You have to give it love, and you have to nurture it. And if you don't do those things, like a pet, it can run away. It can it can run away to find a new owner, or it can die. Whereas on the other hand, if you take good care of it, it can even have a baby. It can sort of flourish and be very successful and be very happy. So it's sort of like it's literally like a toy, a pet, but a toy. And I think these were quite amazing. I was definitely of that age that you said, and I remember all my friends had one. I had one. I lost it very promptly, and I was devastated. But they were such a huge thing in the late 1990s.
Well, so tell us more about then this resurgence, Rebecca. I mean, at this point, these pets will have had many, many, many babies over 30 years. What is keeping this going now?
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because they've sort of actually flourished again. So they sort of died down and then they came back again just recently. So I think it's 2019. And then apparently the company, which is Bandai Namco, which is a Japanese company, not surprisingly, they're saying that sales doubled between 2022 and 2023. So to give context as well, they're saying in 2023, they sold about 90 million of these little eggs, these little Tamagotchi. So 90 million of these devices everywhere around the world. So definitely a resurgence. I think a lot of it is this sort of nostalgia. There is also this generation of people who are kind of, rebelling against smartphones and kind of high tech, and they're sort of, embracing retro tech, if you want to call it that, or retro low tech even.
Now, Rebecca, full disclosure, somehow this craze in the late 1990s completely passed me by, so I might be one of the first people to go to this new London store to check out what it's all about. But tell us, why London?
Yeah, they're a bit funny, actually. They haven't specifically said why London, but they have said that this is the first time, as you said, it's the first time they've opened a store in the UK. And they've also really pointed out that even in the height of the popularity in the late 1990s, there was no store in the UK. So in a way, it makes me think that the way that they're sort of messaging this makes me think, was it sort of a coup that they never really managed to open a store in the UK and this is their chance to do it, 25 years later? Or is it that surface, or is it just that this is such a great market for something like this? It is in Camden, which is also, a kind of a hub of nostalgia. You can find great vintage everything in Camden. So it kind of fits as well as a neighborhood for the store.
Well, Rebecca, just tell us more about this nostalgia movement then. How much is this kind of gathering steam, I guess? I mean, I, for one, myself was telling my colleagues here that I have a new old Nintendo Entertainment System console, which you can also now get from way back in the 80s. And I am very much dating myself with that one. But what kind of low-tech video games are out there at the moment? What kind of resurgence are we seeing?
I think it's interesting because obviously, with kind of all the big games that we've been talking about over the last few years, Minecraft, all of these ones, they're all very high tech. And I think it's almost a generation younger than that is sort of embracing this lower tech. There was retro fashion, retro trends in general, kind of everything 90s feels very, very new and fresh again to this young generation. And interestingly, Bandai Namco, the company, they also own the license for Pac-Man, which also is very nostalgic and very kind of retro as well in that feel. In a way, it's sort of a simpler time, potentially. It's kind of harking back to when, things weren't quite so complicated, whether that's politically or economically or social media obviously has complicated things for young people drastically. So there's, potentially it's a little bit of a response to those trends as well.
And just finally, what is it about Japan that they are able to do this in the video game market? It's sort of a soft power that they're able to keep this going, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I love this, actually. I read that, actually, surprisingly, they're actually the video game market in Japan is the third biggest. So it is actually third in the world. It's not the biggest. That's after the US and China. But when you think about it, there's, a lot of big electronics companies that are Japanese. So Sony, Panasonic, Toshiba, and they are still powerhouses in that way. So I think to think of kind of video games and electronics in general as being kind of a Japanese superpower or soft power, I think is still quite accurate, which is nice to see after all these years.
Do go check out the store in London if you happen to be in Camden. That was Rebecca Tay. Thank you very much for joining us. And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Tom Webb. Our researchers were Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Jumani. And our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.